past December and the usual flurry of activity to stop drink driving. Despite a hard-hitting government advertising campaign and the concerted efforts of the police armed with breathalyzers, the figures showed a hard core of offenders apparently unwilling to respond to persuasion. But this picture, so popular with the police and the media, isn't telling the whole story. And it could in fact be giving a false sense of security to a great many drivers who would never dream of drinking and driving. What's forgotten is the change in driver behaviour over the last decade. In 1981, 3 out of every 10 drivers given a breath test after being involved in an injury accident failed that test. A decade later, the figure had dropped to 8%, less than 1 in 10. That sounds dramatic, but the real picture has become confused, quite simply because the police have got hung up on using the breathalyzer. The number of drivers involved in the accident has stayed pretty constant, but the number of breath tests has more than doubled. Look at the actual percentage of breath test failures among the drivers involved, and the fall is from 3.1% to 2.2%. But the real point is this. Only 2% of all drivers involved in injury accidents actually failed the breath test. And yet you'd be forgiven for thinking that drink driving was a major cause of road accidents. Professor Jim Horn has other ideas.
Well, for 2 years now we've been looking at motorways in the Midlands involving 6 police forces. In the month of August we were able to look at all accidents on motorways, and we certainly find that something like between 20 and 30% of all accidents on motorways around here seem to be due to drivers falling asleep at the wheel. Drivers having accidents whilst falling asleep has been around for a long time, but the questions asked at the scene of the accident haven't been the right ones. For instance, on the accident report forms, it's put down inattention or failed to notice the vehicle ahead. But very often this inattention is actually falling asleep. Because actually the question, did you fall asleep at the wheel, is seldom actually asked.
Thames Valley Police are not surprised by these findings. They've found fatigue a major factor in accidents on all sorts of roads, but particularly on trunk roads and motorways like the M40.
Basically, we are conducting our own little test at the moment, but we have done a bit of research in as much as 1991. The figures were something like 11% of accidents were caused by fatigue and illness. And in 1992, that figure has now risen to 18.5%, which are fatigue, illness related.
Talk to professionals like these lorry drivers starting work at 4 a.m. on the M25, and you soon find that keeping alert is a common problem. But there are some stretches of our motorway network that are worse than others.
The M40, strangely enough, for some reason, it seems to be a very boring piece of road.
Have you seen other lorry drivers who are affected by being sleepy at the wheel?
Now and again, the odd one or two. It's very, very unusual, but you do see them drifting onto the hard shoulder, and you see them coming back out, and you see them drift back again.
You do see like lorries swaying about and things like that, and it sort of livens you up, and you think to yourself, oh, I wish you would pull over or something, you know?
2 or 3 of our drivers were killed years ago because we used to work round the clock when it was a 24-hour day. 24 hours a day we worked, and that was it.
Lorry drivers face particular difficulties because of their long hours and disrupted sleep patterns. And according to Professor Horn, falling asleep at the wheel can often be the reason behind this kind of early morning radio announcement.
In Cambridgeshire, an articulated lorry has jackknifed on the northbound M11 just before junction 9.
Most prone are people who are driving between the hours of about 3 and 7 o'clock in the morning. This is a very valuable time. And I think one can say fairly categorically now that any accident which occurs on a very dull piece of road, not necessarily a motorway, but in the other trunk roads, for example, between the hours of 3 and 7 o'clock in the morning, under good motor conditions with no mechanical defect in the vehicle, then the most likely cause of this accident is a driver falling asleep.
If you do find yourself falling asleep on the motorway, you may be lucky enough to roll over one of these rumble strips on the side of the hard shoulder, and that may be enough to keep you awake. But police in Nottinghamshire have discovered that 30% of accidents happen actually on the hard shoulder, which clearly indicates that a great many drivers are simply wandering out of their lanes through falling ill, and this is much more likely through falling asleep. Should the accident end in a court case, the results may come out very differently. On the M42, a lorry driver was believed to have fallen asleep in this accident, which left 6 dead. He's serving 3 years in jail. Yet on the M5, a lorry ploughed into a broken-down van and a recovery vehicle on the hard shoulder, killing 2 young men, and the driver was acquitted. In this case, which we've staged using equivalent vehicles, a special element was introduced when an expert witness testified that the lorry driver was driving without awareness.
When drivers are in this state, it's very difficult for them to do anything about it, because by definition, I mean, they are driving without awareness, which means they're driving without awareness of their own state. If nothing novel or untoward happens, nothing snaps them out of this state, and so they effectively are behaving like an automaton and are not monitoring their own actions.
The lorry driver had recently taken a break and so was apparently acting responsibly. And yet he drove straight down the hard shoulder of the motorway for several hundreds of yards like this without ever reacting to the flashing lights in front of him. And bear in mind that in the real accident, the motorway was lit.
The so-called accidents which have occurred through driving without awareness are simply accidents due to drivers falling asleep at the wheel. The idea of highway hypnosis, where you're sometimes hypnotised by the monotony of the motorway, and you can perhaps be sort of hypnotised for many minutes, 20 minutes at a time, I think it's unsubstantiated. The idea that just because some people can't remember that they've driven the last 20 miles, there's no indication that they're in this driving without awareness or hypnotised state.
In fact, this case is doubly significant because we understand that next month the Court of Appeal will be examining this point of law in a special inquiry. It's not to review the outcome of the case, but to clarify the question of whether driving without awareness really is some form of automatism, and if it is, whether it's possible that the driver could be rendered blameless in the event of an accident. The lorry driver in this case may have been acquitted, but he no longer drives a truck. It turned out that he'd had 2 other accidents, killed 2 more people, one of them a policeman on the hard shoulder. The DVLA took away his license. So how do we stop ourselves from falling asleep at the wheel? Well, on a personal level, it's obvious that manufacturers are constantly trying to make their cars more comfortable. This Lexus, for example, certainly rates up there with Jaguar and Mercedes in terms of comfort. The downside to that is that it's rather like driving a bed. So some practical words of advice. Don't let yourself get too hot and stuffy in the car. Play some music. Talk to your passengers. Talk to yourself. Or pull off and take a break. One of the reasons the M40 is so bad is that there are no service areas from the M20 near Dover all the way round to Worcester on the M5, some 190 miles. Now that's not so bad for a car driver who can leave the motorway at any junction and park in a field entrance, but it's no joke in a 38-ton Arctic. Thames Valley Police have discovered twice as many accidents involving drivers coming north from the Channel ports, leaving behind them that barren expanse of motorway, than there are involving drivers coming south from the Midlands, where there are loads of service areas. And we don't go in for parking-only rest areas like the French. A busy car park like this is much less appropriate for a quiet nap or a refreshing stroll. The Department of Transport appears to believe that such French-style rest areas would be dangerous for women travelling alone. The industry is taking the problem pretty seriously. Ford have equipped this Granada with a number of cameras to monitor my every move. There's one here on the dash, another directly in front of me, and yet another over my shoulder. At the same time, there are sensors on the steering wheel, on the brakes, and in the engine to log my driving behaviour. John Schofield is an engineer on the project.
We're taking all the data that we're getting from the sensors around the car and looking for changes in the patterns within those. Then we want to focus on the driver's blink behaviour. We believe the change in blink behaviour, the rate of blink, the duration of blink is key to understanding changes in the driver's level of alertness. Once we understand the changes in patterns that are held within this data from the sensors, then we can look at the best means to convey that information to the driver. We do away with the need completely for the camera in the car.
If that's all a little too high-tech for you, well, maybe you should try something like this. It's a little bleeper which you just turn on at the side. You put it onto your right ear, And then, should you nod off whilst at the wheel, a little bleep sounds. Now that's great, at least it tells you that you're nodding off. What it doesn't tell you to do is get out of your car and walk around. There are other solutions. Nissan are looking at the possibility of using aromatherapy. But this little gadget is already on the market. It plugs into your cigarette lighter, and we're told that it releases essential oils like chamomile and juniper. Actually, I found it extremely sickly. So are there any simple solutions? Well, clearly, not yet. But what we should press for is more police action, like the Thames Valley Force's exhibition at Junction 10 of the M40 starting next week, and a high-profile government campaign to make tired driving as antisocial as drink driving. But in the end, it's the individual who's responsible, so remember to stop and rest or take a walk. After all, it's not a new problem. The music I've been listening to was recorded 20 years ago by an American country rock band called Asleep at the Wheel.